Leftists often put the focus of the blame for environmental destruction on the excesses of capitalism, but in the 20th century it was the superpower of communism that was guilty of what's perhaps the greatest environmental crime of the 20th century, fueled by Soviet bureaucracy and the man-centered materialist creed of communist materialism. The Soviet Union was a party to the International Convention for the Regulation of Whaling, a 1946 treaty that limited countries to a set quota of whales each year. But by the time the ban on commercial whaling went into effect in 1986, the Soviets had reported killing a total of over 2,700 humpback whales in the southern hemisphere. While the IWC voted to enact a moratorium on commercial whaling in 1982, the worrisome loss of whales was noticeable much earlier. In 1946, whaling nations formed IWC and attempted to make the industry more sustainable through gradual rules, quotas and size limits, but it wasn't working. In the following 3 decades, Soviet fleets secretly killed almost 180,000 whales, and in the process irreparably harmed the population of many species of whale. The most extreme example of this is the northeastern Pacific right whale, which is now almost extinct. It's estimated that there are perhaps fewer than 30 of them left alive. So the Soviets killed over 180,000 whales illegally, driving several species to the brink of extinction. But the real tragedy is that the Soviet Union had little real demand for whale products. Once the blubber was cut away for conversion into oil, the rest of the animal was left in the sea to rot or thrown into a furnace and reduced to bone meal, which was a low value material used for fertilizer, made from the few animal byproducts that slaughterhouses and fish canneries couldn't put into more profitable use. And the carcasses of these whales were lumped in there as well as this kind of genetic biological trash. While the Japanese whalers used 90% of the hunted whale carcasses, and whatever you think about Japanese whaling, at the very least they were satisfying a real demand that existed on the Japanese mainland. The Soviets used less than 30% of hunted whale carcass. So why did a country with so little use for whales kill so many of them? The answer to this didn't appear until 2008, when the memoir of Alfred Berzin, who was a Soviet-era fisheries scientist, was published. And I'm going to read a summary here. The Soviet whalers, Berzin wrote, had been sent forth to kill whales for little reason other than to say that they had killed them. They were motivated by an obligation to satisfy obscure line items in the 5-year plans that drove the Soviet economy, which had been set with little regard for the Soviet Union's actual demand for whale products. Quote, "Whalers knew that no matter what, the plan must be met." Berzin wrote that by the 1960s there were too few humpbacks left in the southern hemisphere to bother hunting, and the Soviet fleets had turned their attention northward to other species and other oceans, in particular the North Pacific. From 1961 to 1964, Soviet catches in the North Pacific jumped from less than 4,000 whales a year to nearly 13,000. In 1965, a Soviet scientist noted that the blue whale was commercially extinct in the North Pacific and would soon be gone entirely. After one more year of such intensive activities. Another researcher warned of the region's humpbacks. Quote, "Whale stocks will be so depleted that it will be impossible to continue any whaling." Berzin, who had sailed along the Aleutian Islands to the Gulf of Alaska and back aboard the Aleut in the late 1950s, recalled seeing so many spouting humpbacks that their blows reminded him of a forest. Scanning the same horizon from the deck of a boat years later, he saw only blubber-stripped carcasses bobbing on the waves. And this was grueling work. One former whaler, writing many years later in a Moscow newspaper, claimed that 5 or 6 Soviet crewmen died on the Southern Hemisphere expeditions each year, and that a comparable number went mad. A scientist working aboard a factory ship in the Antarctic on a later voyage described seeing a deckhand lose his footing on a blubber-slicked deck and catch his legs in a coil of whale intestine as it slid overboard. By the time his mates were able to retrieve him from the water, he had succumbed to hypothermia. He was buried at sea, lowered into the water with a pair of harpoons to weight down his body. In summary, on the destruction that this genocide did, a paper by Yulia Ivashchenko and Philip Clapham, who were the first ones really to study this and out the numbers on it, they say, quote, "In all, during 40 years of whaling in the Antarctic, the USSR reported 185,778 whales taken, but at least 338,336 were actually killed. Data for the North Pacific are currently incomplete, but from provisional data we estimate that at least 30,000 whales were killed illegally in the ocean. Overall, we judge that, worldwide, the USSR killed approximately 180,000 whales illegally and caused a number of population crashes. 2 such crashes were particularly obvious. Soviet catches of almost 25,000 humpback whales in the Antarctic south of Australia and New Zealand in 1959-61 forced the closure of the shore whaling stations in those 2 countries. Elsewhere, Soviet catches of right whales in the eastern North Pacific in the 1960s devastated an already small population, which was recently estimated through mercury capture analysis at only 30 animals. The impact of Soviet catches on other populations has not been fully assessed. You know, as I was reading these papers, I went to Twitter and I saw that popular on Twitter today is some album of German prison guards at Auschwitz was released, and people are sharing this, talking about the banality of evil and how these Germans just looked like ordinary happy family people, and they love to talk about the banality of evil, that seemingly ordinary good people could be committing mass genocide. And at the same time, a lot of these people blame capitalism, and in large part rightly so, for the environmental destruction being done. But they valorize this kind of materialist, Marxist communism. And to me, the real banality of evil is not to be found in the traditional genocides that people point to, because and we have to be careful what we say here, don't we, but if someone is motivated by hate, there's at least a passion there. Hate suggests it's inverse of love, but the kind of ruthless genocide that the Soviets committed here, that literally wiped out entire species of whales, was done to meet quotas, and that to me is surely the finest expression of the banality of evil. One of the most chilling things about reading about this was it was said that even some of the figureheads of this started to realise how bad things were getting, and that species of whales were just disappearing. And it got to the point that they were brave enough to bring it to the Minister for Fisheries in the Soviet Union. And they pointed out to him that if he continued going the route they were going, their grandchildren would possibly live in a world without whales and never see a whale. And this minister's answer was that their grandchildren didn't have the power to get him fired. And so in this bureaucratic state, in this state that was built on a man-centered, human-centered, atheistic, materialist vision of the world, people were capable not only of putting their own individual lives above entire species of other animals, but they were capable even of putting simply their career progression or their own material comfort over the existence of entire species. And to think that literally hundreds of thousands of whales were just mercilessly slaughtered and dumped into the ocean. There's accounts of parts of the North Atlantic Sea being literally red with blood as these ships sail through it. And to think that people can engage in this because of something as banal as a quota is truly disturbing. And when liberals like to talk about evil, and they talk about the great hatred that people are capable of, really the greater part of evil in the 20th century didn't come from hatred. The greater part of evil in the 20th century came from ideology. It came from our tendency to place the unreal over the real, to place an abstraction like a 5-year plan, or like the progress of a dialectical materialist vision of history, or the triumph of socialism in the 20th century. The capacity of the human mind to place these unreal things over the real and to engage in the most senseless, brutal destruction of the real, of nature and life itself, that which is most immediately real to us. I think that's the greatest source of evil. And what we're witnessing today in liberalism, what we're witnessing with the denial of gender, with the denial of fundamental biological realities, with the denial of people's animal tribalistic nature, and the tendency for liberals to ignore the problems that are arising from trying to bypass this, the capacity for good people to ignore massive levels of abuse in places like Rotherham and many other European cities, the capacity to ignore this because this real example of suffering, of life that is contrary to what is natural, the capacity to ignore these effects because it conflicts with an abstract ideology of how the world should be, of how the world should fit these systems that we've devised in our head. That to me is the greatest source of evil.